Part in the history of Mesa Verde. When we're talking about the people here and the history of this area as a whole, that story begins with people being on this continent about 14,000 years ago. So it's been a very long time since people have been on this area of the world. The story of Mesa Verde comes on to play a little later on, but when we're looking at this time frame of people living well before taking permanent root, they're largely migrational. They weren't taking permanent root anywhere, really. They were going to different spaces wherever it made sense to them to basically collect what was naturally available. So when we look at it below, we have a large pinyon juniper forest. And one of the biggest productions of that is pinyon pine, and pinyon pine nuts, I should say. So those were probably the biggest reason people were coming to this area. They only really bloom those fruits every 5 to 7 years. So we're actually in that season now. You'll see a bunch of little pine droppings here and there. Wow. But that's largely probably the reason people started to come here to start. But we start to see the history of people actually making permanent homes here 1,400 years ago. In the year 600 or so is when we first start seeing the first permanent homes being built in Mesa Verde. All of that is happening up top. So the first homes pretty much start up top there. They're the pit houses. They are constructed out of basically just digging a hole into the ground, then using stone to create enough structural support for your walls, which are kind of woven together bits of branch. So very straightforward construction, incredibly cool inside of them. When you're inside, they're much, much cooler than outside. And they had a lot of different cool little features that were used well up until people decided to move on. So they started there. From there, continued to work more and more with stone until they were working with stone brick and straight those into their homes. That's largely where the Pueblo style of architecture comes from. And that was 600 years of history that we're glancing over just right there. When we're talking about the alcove spaces, Cliff Palace being one of them, this is only 100 years of history of that 700 years of history that we have for just this area. At least just of people living in this area. So it's a very small little pocket in time. There's a lot of time frames we're going to glance over or really hardly even talk about. As we're going through, that's really the biggest thing to keep in mind is that we got about 45 minutes. There's so much to talk about in Mesa Verde. I don't know everything in Mesa Verde. I'm still learning a lot of things. And we're not going to be able to learn everything. But there's a lot of different resources available outside of this. I recommend going to the Mesa Top Loop if you haven't already. That's going to be a great chronological history of the area. But as we're going through, my main focus is on the people. There's a lot of different things. I gave you a whole lot of information to start out. When people were living here, they were living on top. They were farming primarily. That's really the biggest thing that they focused on, was agriculture. And that agriculture continued until we moved down here, and those farms stayed there. So we had our way down into this space. How do you think the people were getting in and out from here? We weren't using our same exit. That was built later. On the cliff. Yep. So as we're leaving on our exit, you'll see their original hand and toe hold. But when life moved down here, it didn't stop up there. There's still a lot more going on up there. People were going to their farms every day from here to the top to just continue working. But when we think about all these different things, there's a lot of different bits of information. There's a lot of ways we can put into numbers when people were living here, how many people lived here. It's about 150 rooms, probably about 100 people lived here. There's a lot of different ways where we can calculate and really quantify the existence of these people. But that's really one thing that we would like to consider. That they didn't really ask for that. They didn't need that when they were living here. They didn't consider what was going to happen 700 years from when they were leaving. So as we're kind of going through, that's a really big thing, is that when we think of the words we use to describe them, the word we use now is a word we actually used in the beginning in the park service. It's Ancestral Pueblo. But when we consider that term, they didn't consider themselves to be anybody's ancestor, and they were not really aware of what Pueblo meant. They didn't know Spanish at that time. So they really just considered themselves to be people. And that's how I consider them, and that's how I talk about them. And that's really the best way to kind of think of them as their identity. They were the people, they had mothers, fathers, children, grandparents, aunts and uncles, all living in this space together. And we also have about 21 kivas. We can determine there's about 21 families living here together. So they were all coming together to make this city, I mean, pretty close to a city comparatively to a lot of other cliff dwellings. This space.
So why stay here versus up on top if you got to climb in and out of here so much?
Great question. So when we're thinking about 600 years of history happening on top and then suddenly people move down into these spaces, does anybody have any idea of why they would do that? Or any theory?
Protection.
Protection. That always comes into play for sure. It's easier to understand what's coming.
Cooler.
Cooler.
What?
Water?
What?
War. Maybe war. It's hard to say. There wasn't really any signs of violence on the Mesa top, but nearby, north of here, there were some pretty harsh signs of conflict.
Water?
Food storage is definitely one, and water is probably the biggest one, yeah. So with food storage, we do have a really cool little system here, right up top. There's actually a secondary alcove space, and that's largely where you're putting your crops. The birds don't really like when they do that. It's very cool, very dry. It's very hard for rodents to get up there unless they're very determined. And then you also have dogs throughout the entire home. So definitely food storage, but water is probably the biggest reason. When we consider people settling in the area, the water sources were in the very back of these alcove spaces in something called Steep Spring. So that was their primary source of water outside of what they built up top for check dams, cisterns, reservoirs. They built all those up top, but then we hit a drought, and that rainfall is not coming from there as often as it should. These are still producing water, because there's a lot of water trapped in the sandstone, and that was largely the reason people likely moved down here, is just to get close to those water sources. But we don't know for sure. We don't know if that was the reason. It could be a combination of everything, of, again, defense. It's easier to defend. We have a lot of great cover from the shade and cover from the weather. So there's a lot of different benefits for it, for sure. Probably the only thing not so beneficial is having to climb in and out, I'd say. But they really just needed to move down for, a lot of different reasons that can come into play. But when they were moving down here, they were bringing all of their knowledge that they had up top previously. So they brought all their capability of building, all their capability of agriculture. They weren't starting fresh. They were just starting with a new slate, basically. So we'll continue on through and see a lot of the construction. Again, that's a whole lot of information. Does anybody have any questions?
What did you mean by kiva? What does that term represent?
Kivas, yeah. So kivas are these circular structures that we'll see all throughout. So the best way to describe them now is ceremonial chambers. So we'll get into a little more in depth with it, but they're ceremonial chambers for your family, specifically for your family. All right. We'll lead on here and we'll go a little ways into the plaza. We won't see that too much. That erosion that happens here is basically caused when that water absorbs into the rock. It starts to push out and causes a lot of rockfall. That's pretty natural to the area. And then you can see signs as you add that rockfall pretty common. It's very much common in this area. So most of the alcove space is rockfall. We even have large chunks that were broken off over time. But most of the bricks here were sandstone that they were finding either here or down below or above from their old homes. And to shape them, you'd use a hard stone. It's called a pecking stone. You just basically hammer away at it until you get a nice form. When we're looking up top here, this is all mostly original. We have 80% of this that is still structurally original. Most of the reconstruction is at the front where we're at here now. But back here is probably one of the best remaining bits of original construction. And when we look at this, there's a lot of great brickwork. We even have some mortar that's still original to the time they lived here. We have corners and edges that are still really well done. And this is really a good showcase of what they had knowledge of well before moving down here and started to put into practice here. Again, they were already working with stone and building their homes out of stone above on the Mesa for hundreds of years before we moved down. Then we start moving into about 1909 is when reconstruction on this place happened through the Park Service. Archaeologists had a lot of struggles reconstructing this space. It was not an easy job. When we look at this front side here, this is all reconstructed. You can see a difference between that and these. We have these walls here that, I could see a little bit of a difference in craftsmanship. I'd say that honestly, it's not a very good looking wall. They needed to, get a lot of spaces. A lot of what they were moving to was down below. A lot of the stone that they were finding. So there could be some stones there that weren't even used as brick in the first place. But they were archaeologists. They were masons. We didn't know. But as we look at that, this is really well done, I think. The only thing that's struggling is the mortar, and that's something the Park Service still struggles with today. Everything we have up top here is original. The mortar, all the plaster, everything is still original up in these top towers. And when we look at what our stabilization crew does, they do it at a very microscopic level. They sift sand, they get finer grain, heavier grain. They try all different combinations. There's only 4 main ingredients. It's sand, water, clay, and ash in some cases. And whatever form mixture it is, if it's something with the soil that they're using, something is not adding up with their ratios. That when they do it, they can only really guarantee about 7 years on the work that they do, versus 700 years is what's up there. And that's not to say that they're bad at it, they just don't have as much time with it. This is something that was passed on generation to generation. These people are starting from ground zero. So there's a lot of different, ways that kind of comes into play. And there's always this concept that is used throughout the discussion of Mesa Verde, throughout the discussion of indigenous people all across the world, called indigenous knowledge. And it's an appropriate term, I have no problem with it. But when we consider that, and then we consider the concept of science, for some reason they're never talked about as if they're the same thing, but they're pretty close. When you consider indigenous knowledge, it's knowledge that's passed on descendancy to descendancy. People grow on that. People take what they learned from their ancestors and use it to make something more incredible. Same with science. When you have scientific theories that pop up and are tested and proven, that's used in other people's research, and that continues to move until we get to a better understanding of science. You can't really start in one little field and just pick a point. You need all of the study that happened before that, and it's the exact same way. So indigenous knowledge is indigenous science. They didn't call it that, but it's the exact same methodology. So you need to have a very good understanding of engineering to be able to craft something like this. You need to have a good understanding of physics. A lot of different things that play in just that. But the people here were skilled with agriculture. They were skilled with meteorology even. A lot of different things come into play. So rolling stop, we're going to continue through here. I'm going to cut ahead of you.
There's a kiva. So they're more than just homes. This one you're right. They're more than just homes, they're ceremonial. Last week I feel like 2 miles now. It's only uphill.
Feeling it, eh?
I'm actually really proud of how
You taking any of your recovery? Or today?
No, not today. It's raining. I mean, it's really mainly just for like right after you finish your workout. It's a lot of bad shit.
Yeah, let's just get back. Alright. Well, as we look on into this space, this is one of the kivas, as I mentioned before. We have 21 kiva structures. We also have an additional 2 kiva-like structures, what we call kihus. So, really, the full explanation of them is a little hard to explain. They're really experiential rather than something you can really explain in words. It's a lot of the way that I can describe a lot of ceremony, a lot of dances that take place. I can't really explain them to you. There are some spaces that they're going to be open to public. I recommend if you ever see one of those, if you ever get a chance, definitely go. That's the best way to understand a lot of what's going on in the societies today and the societies that we're having here. But the best way to kind of explain it is that all of our kivas are missing a very key feature, and that's the roof. These are spaces that were incredibly private. They were connected to one clan or one family. Likely this is where this clan lived, and this was the kiva that they used. And inside of here is where they practiced private ceremony. I can't say for sure what was happening in this kiva. It was related to, a lot of the things that you'd hope for in life. A lot of things that really doesn't set us apart from how we live now to when they lived. They wanted good food, good water, and a nice place to sleep. That's really it. That's the best way to kind of explain what people were hoping for and praying for. There's a lot of spirituality that ties in. I don't want to oversimplify it by saying that, but when we're looking in these spaces, it's a space for those private ceremonies to be taking place, but it's also a place for you to gather with your family. Very similar to what you'd have with a family room, a space where you get together and have very big conversations with your extended relatives, with your family. It's almost like having a holiday table, having your family in the living room and during the holidays. Talking about a lot of your successes, talking a lot about what you want to accomplish in the next couple of years, next couple of months, next couple of days even. If you're planning on any sort of trip, this is where that conversation would happen. And it's also a space where you'd have very normal conversations. If you were just you and one of your cousins and you're talking about your kid, I hope my kid's growing up well. I hope I'm giving them everything that they need to succeed. I hope that they're learning what we're trying to teach them well. It's also a space where you have really hard conversations. When we talk about the time frame people were living here, it's about 100 years. People needed to move down here, likely to get closer to water sources. And then 100 years later, another drought hits the area. So with that in mind, it's really where a space of conversation would have been where I can't feed my kids.
So would you say that given all these people living so close together, the kiva is where you could have a private conversation?
With your family, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So is it more like communal living, or like these were like individual, like the family built their own structure and their own kiva, or was it like a community kind of helped build the entire structure?
Yeah, pretty much the entire community came together for all building. Yeah. And it's, where a lot of those key conversations needed to be had. But then they needed to discuss what needs to happen after. When you get to a point where you're getting rain now, that's really awesome. I think that's something that these people were hoping and praying for many, many days, many, many years. They were constantly hoping for rainfall. So these people needed to decide it's time to move on. And they were the first people who had to do that after 600 years of people living up top, 700 years now, that they needed to make that decision. And a big part of our life and our spirituality comes from migration, moving on, finding home, even if you are home, constantly looking for something that's balancing to you and balancing for your family. So the people who were here decided this wasn't home anymore. It wasn't sustainable to live here. It wasn't providing for them, the key things that they needed, and they decided to move. And we know where they ended up. They ended up mostly in the Rio Grande area. That's where my dad's from. He's from Wenge. There's 21 different pueblos along that way. That's mostly where these people ended up. And people around here. Mesa Verde is not the only part of this story. There's a lot of different things going on around them. But then we have people who went back to Hopi. Hopi was already there when people decided to move on. We have a village called Old Araibi that's been around since the year 900. It's the longest inhabited village in the entire North America. So they were going back home and being with family again, finding that connection again, finding something balancing again. And that's really what happened to these people. It's not really a sense of, you know, any sort of destruction. We don't consider these places to be ruins. They're not the end of civilization. These are some homes that stood. They were built to last, but they were never meant to be permanent. They were already well aware that this was just a stop along the way. Nothing really lasts forever, and everything's kind of a cycle. So they needed to move on, and they found those homes. And the stories and the ceremonies that these people were telling in this space, you hope that after that really incredibly difficult decision, that they're still being told back home. And that's how we understand our connection to these places. When we call this place, you know, Mesa Verde, it's appropriate. You know, it's kind of a misnomer, honestly. It's not even a mesa, it's a cuesta. But we call this place Taldoica in Hopi. This translates to the songs that echo in the canyons. When we look out my dad's side of things, they speak Tewa, and in Tewa they call this place Puse Unge, which means the Black Rim Village. If you look up, there's a lot of desert varnish along the rim of the canyon. Pretty big black rim. We understand a lot of our connection to this place, and you know that connection has always been there. There was never a time where we forgot. And now we're in a really incredible time with the Park Service where those stories are being taken into credibility. And archaeologists and people who are working on the cultural side of things are working more closely with connected communities to tell a better story, a wider story, and a better understood story. So I feel really lucky to be able to tell that with you. And really the best way to, you know, end this is by saying there really is no end. When people moved here, they didn't start here, and they moved on, they didn't end here. And those people and their decisions and their sacrifices and all their achievements are still being used back home. And those stories are still being told. So really the best way I can say to end it is as we're leaving, we're going to be walking in footstep with the way that they would leave too. We'd be leaving along the edge of here. As you leave on the right-hand side as we're climbing the stairs, just before you get to the first ladder, there are going to be some hand and toe hold trails that are carved into the rock face. And that was their original exit. And we'll kind of walk in parallel for time until we split off and make our way much more safely up the ladder. But with that in mind, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. You guys have a great rest of your trip.
Thank you.
Thank you.